to our panel, what are the elites for the left. Some information about our platypus chapter is we have pub nights every Wednesday in the Anthill Pub. We also have reading groups, usually around this time of the evening, right across the hall. For any information, please reach out to our email or Instagram. So just to kick us off, I'm gonna do bios in order. So Benjamin Studebaker holds a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. His new book, Legitimacy and Liberal Democracy, is now available in paperback for $25. Is that true? Okay. Ben Burgis, to the I guess right for you guys, is a Jacobin columnist and the host of the YouTube show and podcast Give Them an Argument. He is the author of several books, including Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, What He Got Wrong, and Why He Still Matters. And to the right of him is Marcello. Marcello is a member of the Los Angeles chapter of the American Communist Party. So our topic today is, what are the elites for the left? Historically, Orthodox Marxists thought that the working class had the potential to overcome capitalism, but they thought this in the context of an international working class movement which no longer exists. Leftists have adapted to the decline of international class politics in many ways, one of which was a theoretical focus on elites. The elites might have been thought of as driving social change through the managerial class, or alternatively, preventing social change as a roadblock to class consciousness. In the 20th century, elite theory tried to learn from the failure of the working class politics and refound the left on a new basis. But did it learn the right lessons? What kind of elite should be the basis for left politics, if any? Are the elites a revolutionary subject, a roadblock to class consciousness, or something else entirely? So everyone is going to give their opening remarks for about 10 minutes in order, and then we're going to have each panelist kind of respond to the other panelists, and then we're kind of going to segue into the Q&A for the audience. Okay, Benjamin Studebaker, you can start.
All right. Elite theories arose when it became evident that the working class was not capable of doing revolutionary politics. I regard them as an attempt to preserve the possibility of politics in the aftermath of this collapse. They involve positing an alternative social unit that is able to do politics. There are all sorts of candidates: the oligarchs, the professionals, the middle class, the students, the new social movements, etc. Elite theories operate from the premise that politics still occurs, so someone must be doing it. The task of the theorist is to figure out how to best describe the social unit that does the politics that must somehow still be going on. But there is another possibility. Politics itself may no longer occur, or its form may have changed, such that it is no longer appropriate to speak in this way. To sort out the degree to which it is still appropriate to speak of politics as something that social units do, we need to have an operational understanding of what it means to be able to do politics. So, for our purposes today, let me suggest that politics involves three things. First, there must be common abstractions about which there is intractable disagreement. We don't agree about what these abstractions mean, but we can nonetheless cooperate with people on the basis of a shared commitment to them. In this way, we have an agreement that contains disagreement. And this agreement can only be had in and through the disagreement. If we try to abolish the disagreement, we can only do this by abolishing the agreement, too. Once we adopt concepts that exclude others outright, it becomes impossible to do politics with those who have been excluded. Their ideals become strange to us, and the possibility of hostility emerges. Conversely, if we insist on full agreement as a prerequisite for cooperative activity, our cooperation is not political in character. It remains limited to the terrain of the social. Second, there must be deliberative institutions through which this disagreement can be processed. In any given situation, we have to decide how to operationalize our shared abstractions. But since we understand the abstractions differently in different situations, this operationalization will generate acrimony. The deliberation is not for the purposes of avoiding this acrimony. It is itself an acrimonious form of processing in which the deliberants hear each other out and attempt to find a way forward together. The processing does not end in agreement because the disagreement is intractable. So politics requires a third thing, a closure mechanism capable of ending the deliberation and issuing a decision. Unlike a social consensus or contract, political decisions bind even those who have not been convinced. Political decisions are not merely compromises or exchanges. A political decision makes an imposition. It generates reasonable resentment on the part of those who have not been persuaded. But the bearers of resentment nonetheless submit to the decision. Why do they submit? Perhaps they recognize that the political system is committed to their abstractions, even though it has interpreted them differently in this instance. Or perhaps they see no compelling alternative to the political system that they are capable of realizing. Either way, political decisions bind the recalcitrant. In this way, politics allows for decisions to be taken with a lower level of agreement than is required for social action. So politics is a technology that expands our capacity for action. It is not military action, which involves the use of violence to overcome hostile opposition, nor is it social activity, which operates by agreement and by exchange. Now, critically, politics is also different from administration. Administration is not deliberative. Administration solves the problem of disagreement by creating a chain of individuals, each of whom has defined powers to advance, reject, or demand revisions to whatever is put before them. Sometimes an administrator's decision can be appealed, but there is no possibility of having a deliberation with an administrator. Attempts to deliberate with administrators are socially awkward. They involve a misrecognition of the kind of activity in which one is engaged. It is also unclear whether administrators share common abstractions with those who are subject to their decisions. So administrative decisions often appear opaque and alienating. They can be issued with no explanation. You apply for something, you get rejected, you don't understand why. You demand feedback, you don't get any. Indeed, in demanding feedback, you are being a Karen, asking for something to which you are not entitled. If you don't like the decision, make an appeal through the proper channels. If there is no appeals process, then that's it, it's over. When you approach an administrator, it is as a supplicant, not a citizen. Elite theories conflate hostile activity, social activity, or administrative activity with politics. They claim that politics involves distinguishing between friend and enemy, making compromises and exchanges, or the administration of people. Marxism itself can become an elite theory insofar as Marxists claim that the working class is doing politics when it is doing other things. In an important sense, an elite might be considered to be one who is capable of doing politics, and so to attribute political capacity to a social unit is to attribute eliteness to that unit. The contemporary left conducts discussions among people who do not share common abstractions, or do not have an effective closure mechanism, or both. These discussions are misconstrued as deliberations. The organizations that hold these discussions are talking shops, not political organizations. The people who participate in them are not elites. So am I saying that politics does not occur at all today? No, I think it does still happen. But I do not think elites are the principal political actors. Politics does not occur primarily among social units. It occurs among corporate persons. An elite is a particular person. A corporate person is a person by fiction. Corporate persons are brought into being through the activity of particular people, but they are not reducible to the particular people who personate them. The personators are administrators. They have specific legal powers. They gain through the occupying of offices. They obtain through supplication. They receive these powers only insofar as they use them on behalf of the corporate entity that they personate. If they misuse these powers, they will be disciplined or terminated. Sometimes the personators come to identify with the entities they personate. This identification makes them feel as if corporate actions are their own actions. Very often, corporate actors insist that they are the ones doing the things they are doing. And if you haven't thought about it very hard, it will seem as if this is true. If you simply use your eyes and ears, it will look and sound like they are indeed doing the things they are doing, that they are the elites, and that they are doing politics. But these people are only able to play the roles they play because they have conformed to the administrative incentive structure that distributes roles. Their identification with the roles they have submitted to is a palliative they use to protect themselves from the reality that, in accepting these corporate roles, they become instruments of an impersonal power structure. They do not choose their own abstractions, deliberate about how to operationalize their abstractions, and act on the basis of these deliberations. Have you ever seen Avatar: The Last Airbender? Yes? Good. Do you remember Ko, the face stealer? Okay? Ko is a spirit that wears the faces of particular people. It looks like those people are talking, but they can only speak on behalf of Ko. If you show emotion around Ko, if you become afraid, then he will steal your face. In Avatar, you can survive without a face, but you are caught between life and death. And this condition can persist for a long time. This is what happens to people who personate corporate entities. They are not elites, they are not ruling. They succumb to fear and make supplications to corporate entities. Because they succumb to fear, they are reduced to doing nothing other than enabling Ko to speak. And yet their faces do all the talking and acting, and without their fear, Ko would be unable to speak through them. Elite theorists are deceived by faces. They don't see Ko. Often they do not even remember that Ko is there. Corporate persons are really different from particular persons. The purpose of a corporate entity is not the subject of deliberation, it is stipulated in its charter. The structure of a corporate entity is prefigured in the law. Cool. The laws that create corporations may have been instantiated through political action at some point in the past, but the purpose of these political acts was to depoliticize decision-making, to instantiate an impersonal, non-political mechanism that can issue decisions that previously would have been made through a social or political process. The citizens who made these decisions created the corporate persons as tools, as instruments for achieving their ends. In this sense, corporate persons may have been created by elites, but once they were brought into being, even very prestigious, high-income corporate roles came to be performed by supplicants. It might even be said that corporations are a kind of artificial intelligence, a way of making decisions by a process that no particular person can properly identify with. In and through corporations, law is elevated above politics, and we get what is commonly called the rule of law. But the rule of law is not the rule of man. Man can rule through the use of tools, but man cannot rule as a supplicant to his own tools. The tools, however, can have a politics of their own. Corporate persons can do politics with each other. Indeed, corporate persons can, through politics, make themselves into supplicants to an even higher form of administration. This is how the United States was made. A set of corporate persons came together and, through politics, made a second-order corporate person. This compound corporation has gradually centralized administrative affairs. It turns first-order corporate persons into supplicants. In much the same way, these corporate persons made supplicants out of particular persons. After the United States was made, we heard endless complaints about sovereignty and states' rights, which were the complaints not of particular people, but of the first-order corporate persons against the second order. Marxists misrecognize this process as the subordination of the social to politics and of the social classes to the Bonapartist state. Post-Marxists identify the state as the province of an elite class of one kind or another. But what we are really talking about here is first the subordination of politics to administration, and then of administration to itself. Yeah. This subordination was articulated more than 200 years before Marx wrote the 18th Primaire by Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, and I'll pause for now and let Ben kick off.
All right, so I push back against the description that Jasper started off by reading in two ways, right? First, with all due respect to my hosts, I think the whole thing about refounding the left is one of the platypus society's most unhelpful affectations. Sometimes I think if the earth were invaded by the aliens from War of the Worlds, the rest of us were saying, gosh, this seems really bad. Let's see what we can do to stop it. The platypi would respond by talking about the folly of thinking it was possible to refound the left on the basis of opposing the Martian invasion. Sometimes people say things because we think they're true, and not because we think that whatever we're saying at that moment is the singular code key to capital R, capital L, refounding the left. Secondly, and more importantly, I would push back against the idea that Marxists have historically only thought the working class had the power to overcome capitalism in the context of a powerful international workers' movement, right? That the existence of that context has something to do with why they thought that. Certainly, if you think about the world of the 1840s, when that Marxist analysis first came together, a powerful international workers' movement was much more hope than reality. The reason Marxists have always thought that the working class was the necessary agent of historical change was that it's the only class within capitalist society that has the right combination of interests and capacities to overcome capitalism. The capitalist class itself, of course, has tremendous capacity to overcome capitalism. If every member of the capitalist class was separately visited by the three ghosts from A Christmas Carol and woke up as convinced socialists, they could simply make a gift of the means of production to the rest of us. That just won't happen because it wouldn't serve their interests. And sure, you get the occasional Ingalls here and there, but you really can't count on ghosts coming through when you need them. So the basic premise of all materialist analysis is that over time, most people in certain ways are going to be sufficiently motivated by economic interests that you have to analytically start from that assumption. Conversely, the population of homeless and long-term jobless people sleeping in park benches and under overpasses in every major city have a tremendously strong interest in living in a more equal society. As Joan Robinson liked to put it, as long as we're living under capitalism, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. But they have basically zero capacity to bring about such a society. If that entire population disappeared tomorrow, not only would it not threaten capitalist production in any way, but the capitalists would quietly celebrate a social problem painlessly solved. By contrast, the entire basis of capitalist society is the labor of workers, without whom, as the lyrics of Solidarity Forever put it, not a single wheel can turn. And the wealth of the capitalist class is entirely dependent on the surplus labor extracted from workers, which means that as long as capitalism exists, there's an antagonistic mutual dependency between the interests of capitalists and the interests of workers. And the crucially important disanalogy is that workers could get along just fine without capitalists if we did transition to a different system. Whereas for all the hype about AI supposedly meaning they can do without human labor, the same just isn't true in the other direction. So the working class is the one class where interests meet up with capacities in the right way. That's why Marxists think that the working class is the necessary agent of radical change. The collective action problems are immense and often depressing, and this comes with no guarantees of success. The task of turning a class in itself, i.e. a collection of people who all have the same class position, into a class for itself, i.e. a powerful international workers movement, that once again has retreated to being more of a hope than a reality. That's immensely difficult and it's complicated. Again, there are no guarantees of success. But as long as the sublation of capitalism to socialism remains the goal, finding a way to organize workers into a working class movement remains the job. Okay, but what about the elites the panel prompt is really about? not the capitalists at the tippity top of society, but those messy intermediary layers who have always been such an embarrassment for Marxist analysis. The argument I just finished up laying out only mentioned 3 layers of society: workers, capitalists, and people who are at a social level below the working class, economically oppressed but not exploited because they're just locked out of the economy. And if you read Capital Volume 1, which is the volume which is really about class structure and exploitation, that's also pretty much the map of class relations Marx gives you there. When he talks about independent artisans who are in business for themselves, Marx tends to present them as pre-capitalist relics, like when he discusses some trade formerly dominated by artisans being subsumed, so formerly independent artisans who might have even used capitalist merchants as middlemen to get their goods to consumers, become direct employees. Marx consistently describes that as the capitalist conquest of that sector of the economy. Otherwise, he's pretty much talking about workers and capitalists, plus I guess big landowners in Part 8 especially, and a teensy tiny little bit about paupers and lumpen proletarians in chapter 25. But the most interesting and suggestive passage hinting at a richer class map, and you'll have to forgive me for a little literary license in how I'm parsing this, is in chapter 7, where he's imagining a scenario where a capitalist doesn't make any profits because the revenues are only enough to reproduce the workers' wages, and he imagines the capitalist complaining about this, and in so doing, he puts into the capitalist's mouth all the standard talking points of bourgeois apologists about merit and entrepreneurial risk and all that stuff. And toward the end of all that, he imagines this hypothetical capitalist crying out, "Have I not myself worked? Have I not performed the labor of superintendents of overseeing the spinner? And does not this labor too create value?" And then the next line is, "The capitalist's own overseer and manager shrug their shoulders." And of course, in context, the point of that shrug is to say, hey guys, the thing you're saying the capitalist has done, right, are actually things that any decent-sized capitalist firm he'll pay people to do. There'll be particular specialized employees that do that, which is a good point. But, and this is where the literary license comes in, that image of the worker and the capitalist having an argument while the manager and the foreman shrug their shoulders really does feel like a great symbol of the idea that there's a layer of skilled professionals and managers who have a somewhat ambiguous position in the binary class war between full-on workers and full-on capitalists. Historically, Marxists have had a few different ways of thinking about these layers. The least helpful has been assuming that even if not everyone neatly fits into one of the main categories yet, eventually this problem will be solved by history. Since as capitalism progresses, everyone will either rise into the unambiguous capitalist class or sink into the unambiguous working class. Well, well over a century and a half after Capital was published, I think we can safely say that's not going to happen. Another has been to say that the relatively simple class map you get in Capital, which is the same I was assuming in the argument earlier, has to be substantively revised. This is where PMC theory comes in, the idea there's this professional managerial class in between the two. And there are 2 different lines of thought there that often get mixed up together. First, there's a thread of thinking about professionalized, bureaucratized layers that sort of run the machine for the capitalist that goes back to at least James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution and really has roots before that, which says that maybe what you've actually got is a 3-sided class war between workers and capitalists and this elite PMC group, and that the PMC could easily displace the capitalist class as the new ruling class, and maybe according to some versions of this is what happened in the Soviet Union, and maybe, and this is what the sort of more intellectual side of contemporary right populists tend to think, that's kind of happened under contemporary corporate capitalism. For the record, my own view at least, we can discuss this, is that this is total nonsense. But there's this other version of PMC theory that comes from Barbara and John Ehrenreich, who are thinkers who I have a lot of respect for, and those are the people who first coined the term, and people like my friend Catherine Liu, who teaches here, who's sort of continued in a very Ehrenreichian vein. And this one postulates the PMC as a new subordinate class alongside the working class, with distinct interests, but not really a contender for power. And I think that's at least a little closer to the mark. But the tradition of how to think about this stuff that I find most helpful isn't PMC theory in either variation. It's the Eric Olin Wright view that the class map of capital, the class map of the argument that I went through earlier, is perfectly correct as far as it goes. And a view from 10,000 feet, if we're thinking about grand epochal historical change, that is the right map to use. But Just like with literal maps, you could have different kinds that are different, useful for different purposes, ranging from simple maps that just show you like state and city names and where the ocean is, to topographical maps with little bumps for mountains. And none of these are incorrect. They're just, they just capture different things. They're useful for different purposes. If instead of thinking about grand epochal historical change, we're trying to think about the nitty-gritty of short-term socialist strategy, we're thinking about which kinds of demands will motivate which, layers of the population, which alliances of specific fragments of classes in specific circumstances, then we need to zoom into a lot of details that we're abstracting away from when we use phrases like the working class and the capitalist class. So for people who own their own means of production and try to use them to turn a profit, we're capitalists in that broad sense. We need to ask, are you a self-employed proprietor of a taco truck? Or somebody with a shop with a few employees? Or a big real capitalist with many employees who's living entirely on their labor? And those distinctions are going to have real differences for how your interests are impacted by what's at issue in different kinds of political struggles. I think Zoran Mamdani, for example, had a good instinct in the campaign last year, trying to get these guys who operate little halal stands on board with at least a short-term democratic socialist program, and offering them things in terms of cutting red tape, et cetera, to help cement that kind of alliance. And for people who work for a wage, we could ask questions about how highly skilled you are, which is going to have consequences for how much individual bargaining power you have, and maybe what your attitudes are going to be towards unionization, collective bargaining power. You might think you get a better deal without it. And how much managerial authority you have, and how much autonomy you have in the job. And once we bring in all these factors, we can see the ways that people can be pulled in multiple directions at the same time. So different demands, different mobilizations might succeed in capturing you or not. You might end up, if you're sitting on the fence, you might end up falling off on one side or another, depending on exactly how things shake out. Because you have some interests that align you with the capitalist class, and some interests that align you with the working class in a way that does start to feel a little bit like the position of the traditional petty bourgeoisie. And I know I'm already, I think, probably like 2 minutes over, so one last point if you'll indulge me, and I promise I'll shut up. So I already kind of said this, but I did just want to end by saying it more explicitly. The point of that complicated, messy relief map of contradictory class positions is not to write off people who are in some sense, PMC, who don't have, interests that are purely aligned with the working class, as people that we're not going to be able to organize or mobilize, period. I mean, I'm not going to think that. I'm a very proud member of an adjunct professors union. That's clearly not, that's clearly not my position. It's rather to more carefully calibrate which alliances between different class fragments we need at any given moment, as we try to engage in that immensely difficult and uncertain task of rebuilding the workers' movement. Because again, that's the whole job.
Marcello?
Well, that was very interesting, two very interesting descriptions, which are going against each other. I'll go ahead and talk about my view, the American Communist Party view of the kind of, we could call it Stalinist view. I would say that both of you are partially correct from my position, right? So from this perspective of you have capitalists. What exactly are capitalists? Well, they're kind of at the whims of the forces of capital, right? So the current ruling class is the financial elite. Now, financial elite, which, very interesting example, as opposed to the 1800s. The 1800s, you had to get into the nitty-gritty of actually running a factory and figuring things out. Financial capitalist invests in those people, right? And I think this is maybe the origin of a kind of elite theory, is coming from, well, who can solve the problems for me from the perspective of the financial elite, right? Or if you want to call them elite, financial bourgeoisie is probably a better term. And then from the same perspective of the proletariat, they choose their own representatives. You have union leaders, you have communist leaders, you have the leaders who end up with countries. And to that degree, eliteness is temporal, right? I can solve this problem, I can put together a solution for you, and then it goes into the Studebaker paradigm, and it becomes very calcified, right? That's where it would get into the critique of the Soviet Union and why it fell apart, is a kind of calcification, which is, it's a hairy subject, right? It comes down to then, for instance, the moment we're living in now, where you look at our financial elite and they are exploring different ways of solving a problem that they know exists. So we have a problem, 2008 happened. We had a bunch of people march on Wall Street and express that they're dissatisfied with the current system, and you had the resurgence of a left. That's kind of where this project comes from. American Communist Party traces its roots to that. All the revivals of these different parties trace to that point. And so they said, okay, how do we fix this? And so they went to people who had been building up until this point large systems for control, right? This is cybernetics and things like that. And so you get the development of Twitter, you get the empowerment of people like Elon Musk and things like that. These big kind of persons to follow, and also at the same time different ways of creating systems to divert people's energies in different directions and all this kind of stuff, which was a solution that worked, and now it's not working, right? And it's vague and it's hairy, and it's because that's coming up with a solution. It's not some kind of historic change of means of production. That happens in the background. Means of production comes along and it presents problems for whatever elites are running the society. And you have to grapple with that. And so those elites who happen to take power are going to be people who can solve problems, right? So why did the Bolsheviks come into power? It's because all of the people who were presenting powers before the February Revolution, before the fall of the Tsars and everything like that, Tsars had no fucking idea, and so they failed. And then you had the preliminary government, which came in. It posited a bunch of things. Now, I know that some people might say, oh, if it had had more time or something like this, and there wasn't the coup and all this kind of stuff, that's beyond the point. The point is that when the Bolsheviks came into power, they said this isn't gonna work. People were happy with that, and it worked, and it solved problems. You can disagree with the solutions to the problems in the same way that we can say, well, FDR, he stabilized capitalism, and so on, and that sets up but it makes people happy. That's the role of elites, so we could say it's to forestall change, or it's to usher in a new change, or that's why it gets, you get delineations between, okay, this is PMC, and these guys are bad. They sit on this list of, or whatever, or you get this guy who's good. I like this guy, the union leader, right? The union leader and the politician and the head of a local council, or these kinds of people, they all sit in the same kind of general structure. Now, they might help out a group that we do an analysis on that, and we say, okay, this is helping the proletariat out. We would like to further the demands of this person, or we want to create more elites in this direction, and this kind of thing. That's where the analysis is helpful. But elites are, what is the elites for the left? Vague, right? If we're going to talk about capitalist elites, that's a different thing than a leftist elite, So when we're discussing this kind of stuff, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to take a little bit of time to drink some water.
Oh yeah.
Thank you, Isaac. Because Studebaker brings up this interesting point about the supplication and the calcification of things, and people become faceless in this, and it's not really a representation of, this is no longer a person, this is a sub-person. This is a really fascinating way of describing kind of how, are these people individuals when they enter into power, because if it's functioning, that means that they are working along the lines of either capital or the proletariat, at least on the Marxist understanding. So in some ways, there is no personness to the elites, but on the other end, they're offering a unique solution, which might be different than some other person. So then they bring a personness for that period until the system is constructed. We could describe it like that, perhaps. And then, boy, I wasn't able to take notes on that. You had something in the anyway. Trying to put all that down, anyway. I think that's a good spot to conclude, and we can discuss and we can talk about things.
So, should we have like 10 minutes for?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna have like 10 minutes for responses, or if you wanna kind of wrap up your presentation as well. Do you wanna start, Dr. Studebaker?
Okay. Yeah, so I think maybe one of the major differences with me is that I don't think there is a ruling class. I don't think we have an Aristos. I also don't think we have a demos. I don't think we have any of these units that can crack. And I don't think that I think elite theory came along in part because the working class seems to not be able to crack. And so there's a search for something that can crack.
Interesting. So, when you say you're saying there's no real capitalist force, there's no real demos force, is that correct? So there's no
People. There's no social element that can do politics at scale. There's no social element that can crack. Like, for instance, if the UN Security Council meets, everyone who is participating in the UN Security Council is there to personate a corporate person, and none of those people are free to speak on their own behalf or on the behalf of their social class.
Right. Okay, so, but would that not be just describing how Marx, at least we'll say the view of Marx that we have, which is that a capitalist is not a person in the way you described, right? A capitalist is someone who has to pursue different goals because that's the situation that they find themselves in. And in order to continue their existence, they have to take certain actions. And so when you have a country meeting in the UN, this is a capitalist country, or it's a communist country, or it's some kind of, whatever we want to describe it, it has to exist and it has certain social, not even social, there are economic requirements on this country that demand certain actions be taken. And so that's what at least that's how I hear it, is you're describing that this person comes up and he says, I'm a representative of such and such country, and then sits there and lays out demands which are requirements of that country's existence. Is that kind of?
Well, so you can talk about capital, but here I'm really trying to get at the state.
Right.
And the state is, and also private corporations, and also large institutions like the WTO or the IMF that operate through rules that no particular person can simply say, I made that decision. And also you can't say that when a deliberation takes place and there's closure, that anyone who's involved can say that they spoke in that deliberation on their own behalf.
Right. So, well, that,
Sorry, just speaking as
yeah.
a moderator,
oh, sure.
I just want to make sure that Studebaker can, just finish up his responses to both Burgis and you, and then we can go on, just to make sure everyone gets a response
I don't mind
to everyone else.
I mean, it also, I think, Ben, actually,
Sure.
is, what, is this an improper way of conducting this conversation across you?
It's
I just want to make sure everyone gets their chance. I don't really mind what structure we're doing, it's just,
Okay.
sure.
Democracy. Well, I guess the part, I do also have a question for my brother in Bedness, but I have to say, I'm very curious because it's the first time I've heard a self-described Stalinist say the USSR fell because of calcification. Just kind of threw that out there.
Oh, yeah.
Very curious to hear that unpacked.
Right, so to unpack that, so this is part of research that I'm conducting, so I'm actually gonna publish a paper on this. But essentially, so we can talk about different class dynamics that created this, but really what happened was that there was a pursuit of scientific planning and what that meant within the Soviet Union. And so in the Soviet paradigm, you had Stalin's view of scientific planning, which was set a plan, use a spreadsheet to write out that plan, and then spend an enormous amount of time communicating with people to make sure that works. That is not what the other group, this was the cybernetic group. So this is to unpack. There's a misconception that the Soviet Union rejected cybernetics. It was only rejected under Stalin. After Stalin, cybernetics becomes this huge project, massive blow. And the key concept of cybernetics was that we don't want to really have communication between people. We want to ignore the people element and instead use signals, right? So there's a shortage of such and such here, and so we have a computer which dynamically processes that. If this thing is shut down over here, then we dynamically tell someone go and fix it and things like that, which sounds amazing on paper, but is accomplished with the technology of the telephone or talking to people, right? If you've ever worked in a modern cybernetic factory like I have, I worked in UPS, and they had, so UPS was a great version of this, Tesla is a completely opposite version. So in UPS, they had conveyor belts, and the conveyor belts would stop. Now, when they first introduced the conveyor belt, a siren is supposed to go off. It lights up a light in a control room, and then a guy comes out and says, you have to go fix this. But as it turns out, when the conveyor belt breaks, the light breaks. And so this was the problem of cybernetics, and that's what happens in Tesla. So
is that more of a technology problem,
Yes.
or is that a problem of administration itself as a form of making decisions?
Right, but the issue was that technology was a way of enabling a certain kind of administrative attitude, right? So I don't want to have to talk to so-and-so. I don't want to have to sit there and do the difficult work of figuring out what an economy is. I want it to happen for me. And so they spent an enormous amount of time on computation, on mathematical problems, on all this kind of philosophical hair, I guess you could call it, of trying to figure out what it is from the top down. And at the end, in the 80s, they concluded, well, the only way this is going to work is if we have markets. So under Brezhnev, they said we have to marketize the system. And so that was what the project that even for Gorbachev.
Andropov?
Yes, Andropov. Even Andropov is talking about, well, we need to bring markets and things like that. So Gorbachev did it. It's just he did it ineptly, and it kind of destroyed the whole system. Now, the argument that I would make, which is beyond the scope of this, is that I think that the initial idea had a lot more fruit left unexplored. And now we're kind of stuck with, because there's a lot of linkages between the Soviet economy before it collapsed and our current economy, right? The way we talk about price signals to signal things over to Wall Street, who to invest in, all this kind of stuff, it's very similar. It's not the same thing. It's obviously not the same thing, but the principles of what they were aiming for are very much reflected in how Wall Street does things. It's just aimed at different social classes. And so the issues that they are having now, I think, are actually very analogous to the social problems that they were having at the end of the Soviet Union, which is part the alienation that we feel towards these kinds of faceless elites that we see, I think, is a symptom of that system.
And see, for me, an elite can't be faceless by definition.
Well, but I'm saying faceless in the sense that if I step over you, because you're saying that these people are non-people, right?
I'm not saying they're non-people, I'm saying as particular persons, they are supplicants to an impersonal system.
So this is actually, sorry, if we still have time, this is the question I wanted to ask you, because I'm trying to figure out what you mean by saying you don't think there's such a thing as a ruling class, because it seems like you're saying these things about how, like is what a ruling class is to you a class such that their members can just sort of follow their own whims in deciding what happens without being like, you know, in the thrall of more impersonal social forces, because that's certainly not how the phrase ruling class was used in the Marxist tradition.
No, I mean, a ruling class is something which can actually rule, so can actually do politics, so engage in a particular form of activity. So for instance, if you have a senatorial class, that senatorial class meets in the curia, has deliberations, and then issues senatus consultum ultimum, you know, it issues decisions on the basis of the deliberation that it has had. So the senatorial class is a ruling class in the very straightforward sense that the Roman senatorial class has a common object, which is the good of the res publica, meets in a curia, carries out a deliberation, and then issues senatus consultum ultimum, which is a closure mechanism that issues a decision where the Senate gives its opinion.
Well, moving from ancient Rome to the modern world, and then just to, I guess one maybe way of getting clearer on this, right, is in the history of capitalism, is your view that we used to have a ruling class?
So I think that in the construction of the modern state, the ruling class created the conditions under which it would wither away.
When?
The Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Okay, so we haven't had a ruling class for a while.
Yeah, that's just a date I'm throwing out.
Okay.
It would be something, you know, to do with Hobbes and absolutism. It would be the creation of a monarchy where you have politics restricted very much to the king's court. So the aristocrats who previously might have been consulted by the king or convened together in a council are now, if they want to be heard at all, they have to come to Versailles and they have to be in the palace, and they're reduced to a position of supplication to the monarch.
Right.
So this class, which previously ruled, is reduced to supplicating to a monarch, and it's debased by this activity to the point where it loses its capacity to rule and all of its positive qualities. Like when Montesquieu is writing in the Persian letters about the virtue problem in France, this is itself the ruin of the aristos, which has already happened decades before the French Revolution even takes place.
Right, but would you, because the way I view this, so let's just talk about like, okay, when I see that, here's the supplication of the French aristocracy to the French king. That was a specific technology that feudalism developed out of France, just from particularity, to make itself more resilient. Because before then, the aristocracy would fight each other. Well, I'm gonna erect a palace and say, come here, don't fight each other, wear wigs so you all look silly, and now you know each other, you're not gonna fight any kind of disagreements you bring in here, but that doesn't remove the fact that they're feudal landlords, and they're still collecting tax from people.
But you can be a feudal landlord and not be a ruler and not be capable of doing politics. You can still own land and have certain social functions.
Yes.
Without having that political capacity. Like Elon Musk is not a ruler.
Right.
He's a supplicant to the US government. He begs the US government for money all the time, and that's how he became rich. His whole life has been making supplications to entities that are external to him, that are corporate, and he feels oppressed by those entities, which is why he carries on now in the way that he does.
Okay, so then when you talk about Rome, was the Roman Senate not that?
The Roman Senate could actually issue decisions. Now, the Roman emperor in the period of the empire was still expected as an emperor to consult with the Senate.
Right.
There was a norm of consultation, which if the emperor didn't follow, would cause him to not be regarded as the emperor and would result in plots against him.
So it sounds like ruling class means people who are directly exercising political power.
Yeah, people who can do politics.
So which you know, like I'm just trying to like figure out how to relate it to the usage of the term I'm more familiar with, right? Which is, you know, when we talk about the ruling class of a given society, we mean the class on behalf of whose interests, right? You know, the superstructure of that society.
Certainly that's what the corporate person invites those people to believe. There's a sort of legitimation story that the corporate person tells, or a set of legitimation stories that it tells to those people to suggest that it acts on behalf of their interests.
But in reality, modern states don't act on behalf of capitalist interests. That's your view.
My view is that we have a kind of total system.
Okay, so to kind of, let me make a jump and say, what you're describing is that capital itself has disintegrated into every individual person. And so when you are sitting there and talking about, well, these people are not representatives of capital, they're kind of representing the state in a analogous way, because
You can make a case that the state is subject to capital, but not capitalists.
oh, sure, yeah, that's perfectly.
And capital is not something which the capitalists are able to
But that's
control
always,
or wield.
right, that's always.
Yeah, so I don't think it's that outside the
I
box.
would
My
just-
claim is just that there was, all the way back to Hobbes, and all the way back to the rise of the absolute state.
Right.
We have a corporate person that was instituted to make a pax, right? And the story that Hobbes tells is of people coming together and making a decision to establish a corporate person that will then administer all of their affairs. And they give up the right to form their own views about what's good, deliberate about it, issue decisions. They give up their right to do politics.
Right, but at the same time, here's what I'll say, is that there are always, so this is just, again, temporality, right? So what you're talking about before is kind of the state of anarchy that maybe Hobbes would describe, where, okay, you've got all these different guys, they're all feudal lords and they're killing each other. Or you've got, say, the 1800s, in most capitalist countries, where you've got the capitalists who basically run petty fiefdoms, what do you call it, the company stores, this kind of thing, and then they're attacking each other, they're blowing each other up, and then, well, that's not very helpful. Let's form a kind of conglomeration of these groups so that they're not killing each other. But eventually, that piece shakes apart, and either those forces start killing each other again, as in the case of Rome, or those forces disintegrate into, say, the Soviet Union or the Republic of France or something like that.
There's a thought that politics is fragile and that it's not reliable enough as a means of securing the peace. So you create an administrative and personal machine which is able to make the peace, which politics is not capable of making.
Right. So I would describe that as, that's the path towards the end of whatever politics you're talking about. So the collapse of whatever state is preceded first by the end of the political mechanism.
I think the emergence of the state is the collapse of the political mechanism. The emergence of the state is the political attempting to abolish itself in the state.
I think then to describe what I'm talking about, I think that the state, we're talking kind of in different terms, because there's a monarchy at one point, but then at a certain point, now we're bringing everyone into the king's throne room and we have to force them to work together and they're not killing each other. But before there's a king.
Well, you have this Sieyesian view, which is a way of reinscribing the Hobbesian corporate state in a way that makes it appear consistent potentially with republicanism or with democracy, right?
Right, okay.
Because, like for instance, in the UK, Parliament is sovereign, but Parliament is not in any plausible way obviously reducible to the British people.
Right. So, let's just skip past all the solving. What are the implications that you're drawing from this conclusion?
So the implications that I would draw from this is that we have a kind of legitimation crisis, and people think that this has got to be a crisis which involves social units principally as the units that are discontented with the way the world is run. But I think that a lot of what we're seeing right now is a legitimation crisis in which first and second order corporate persons are discontented with the behavior of second and third order corporate persons. So for instance, the United States is discontented with the WTO appellate body. The Obama administration refuses to reappoint a couple of appellate body judges to additional terms, and then the Trump administration stops appointing anyone to the WTO appellate body so as to shut it down and break it, right? And now the WTO appellate body doesn't work. So the United States, which is a second-order corporate person in my sense, because it's created by the states uniting together, it's not created directly by the population, right? The states come together at the Constitutional Convention. The people at the Constitutional Convention are representatives of their states, so they're personating their states. At the Constitutional Convention, you make the United States. Then after World War II, the United States comes together with other state actors and creates third-order corporate persons. And then gradually over time, the United States has become discontented with the behavior and conduct of the third-order corporate persons, which seem to be trying to make the United States into a supplicant. So the United States has to go to the WTO and participate in the WTO institution and abide by the WTO ruling. And the United States goes, what the heck? The WTO is supposed to be a tool of the United States. It's not supposed to subjugate the United States or force the United States to act like a supplicant. So the United States is now rebelling against the WTO. But this is something which is happening at the level of corporate persons. It doesn't really involve the social very much, or any social unit very much at all.
Well, okay, so to disagree, I think the reason why we're in the position that we are, right? The reason why the United States is doing what it's doing, why Trump is doing what it's doing, is because you have different levels of capital breakdown, right? So the empire is breaking down. We're less successful in extracting wealth overseas, at least from the perspective that, hey, not every transaction is done in dollars anymore. Less and less transactions are done in dollars. And then here, okay, that cascades down, and it means companies are less profitable. And they're running up against, you've got all of these regulations which we set up. Now, are those regulations hurting those companies? No, and more often than not, they're helping those companies. But they prevent the companies from, for instance, doing initial sell-offs and just stealing money from people, firing all their workers and maybe moving overseas, or from doing very illegal things, like maybe if we just set up a big slave operation, maybe we can generate capital in this way, but that's illegal, so we're upset about those regulations. And so, okay, you've set up this massive Byzantine style of administrative nightmare that you're describing, and it's gotten in the way. Now,
Sorry, I just want to ask if we can wrap this up, if anyone has any remarks. So we're gonna do the Q&A. I'm going to ask that each panelist do their own response and not be interrupted during their response, and then we can kind of take turns. And it's all right if you want to respond to someone else's, or if you want to come back to yourself in the same question. It's just we need to have people taking their own turns. Okay. Does anyone have any questions in the audience about the panel?
For Benjamin Studebaker, why do corporate persons need to personate at all into individual persons? What does that accomplish for them?
They have to be able to act in physical reality. And so they need bodies. They need...
Is there a world in which they wouldn't need bodies?
There may be a world in which they can do more without meatbag bodies, where they might be able to do more with other kinds of bodies, where the specific physical way in which they operate changes. This happens all the time in terms of the level of the military technology that we develop, which changes how corporate persons can act, and the degree to which they need large numbers of people. One of the things that really matters about the way the world works is whether corporate persons require mass mobilization armies that include millions of young people who are conscripted through a draft to be able to conduct war. If they don't require that, then they don't rely on those people, which weakens their reliance on social units and increases their capacity to administer the population and convert the population into that kind of supplicant that's more pliable. There's something about the lumpen, which does seem to apply to people who are in administrative roles, in the sense that there's a lot of begging that's going on, and the begging messes with the way that you think. If you're in the habit all the time of begging people for grants, like many academics are, we beg people for things. If you beg and beg and beg all the time, then it changes your subjectivity, right? Whereas if the state needs you to serve in the military and needs you to cooperate and needs you to hold a gun or the bayonet and run from one trench to another, this is going to give you some leverage that you're, especially if it needs millions of people to do this all at once, that you're not going to have once that's heavily technologized.
Does any other panelists have any reflections on corporate persons or want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think that is a really good way of pointing out how this kind of modern phenomenon that you were describing really does come out of the cybernetics of the 1940s to the 70s, which described how is it that we can create the perfect administrator that is a computer and doesn't need to be, corporealized into a person. And that's the vibe I'm getting from the way that you described, as we were going down that description of your state. I'll pass on and see if there's any questions. There's more I'd like to discuss with you about that.
Yeah, anything from Ben Burgis?
Not really. I mean, I'm vaguely tempted to push on how much cybernetics were really a thing in the late Soviet economy,
Sure.
as far as setting prices and stuff, but I'm worried about getting us
Yeah.
way off track.
We can talk about it after, maybe.
Sure.
Yeah. It's very fascinating.
Do you have a question, gentleman in the ACP hat?
Yeah, sure. I guess regarding like the question to the ability to do politics, or this kind of like perfect cybernetic administration that exists, it feels like we're talking a lot around the concept of AI and these LLMs that seem to have been the, whatever you want to call the ruling class's attempt to administrate the existing U.S. state. But with Peter Thiel leaving to Argentina, it seems like maybe this is failing. Kind of be interested in kind of discussion of that, and then I guess the second point regarding that is, if that doesn't, if that's not a sufficient kind of politics, why not the politics in the Clausewitzian sense, where we have like a war as a continuation of politics by other means, in the sense that the U.S. now embraces a kind of military nihilism, where we have no way of really administering anything outside of just pure military might or force, or I don't know if that would really count as politics. And I kind of just want a kind of a general discussion around maybe those two kind of points from each of the panelists, if possible.
Yeah, so I take the tech billionaires at their word when they say that they feel compelled to develop the artificial intelligence because they have no choice, it's inevitably going to happen. There is a truth that they are telling you when they say that. They feel that they have to develop this technology because there is a demand for it. If they don't develop it, then someone else is going to make the money instead of their shareholders and the people that they're responsible to. Sometimes they even say that they'd like the technology to be regulated because they know that they are not in charge of it and don't control it. So I would not say that artificial intelligence is the activity of a ruling class. I would say artificial intelligence is another good example of how the particular people who seem to be in charge can't actually make the important decisions. And what's really needed, if we were to control artificial intelligence and make it into a tool in line with, say, what Pope Leo said in his latest encyclical, would be a political capacity that those corporate actors don't possess. They don't have the political capacity to regulate or control artificial intelligence or to put it to some sort of political or social use. On the question of military, I would sharply distinguish military activity from administration, because with administration, generally people do what the administrator says. If you get to a point where people don't do the things that administrators say, and you have to use military force continuously all the time rather than just occasionally at the margins to make people do things, at that point you're in the terrain of the hostile. So the military actor is treating the one that you use force against as a stranger who can't be talked to, can't be interacted with at the level of language, has to just be attacked. You can't run any kind of system on a purely military hostile basis for any great length of time. Although people who oppose particular systems will always emphasize and sometimes heavily exaggerate the degree to which it operates on the military hostile basis, because people tend to very much disapprove of systems that operate like that. I mean, such systems don't treat them as worthy of an explanation, worthy of legitimation. You know, the helots in Sparta are the subject of military rule. They are intimidated and terrorized with force. They're not citizens. They're hardly even subjects in the sense in which we would have them today. They much more closely approximate slaves. So it's very difficult to run any kind of large-scale system on that basis, though, of course, military activity and hostile activity does occur at the level of, say, interstate conflict. It tends to occur when, in the modern era, when corporate persons are unable to cooperate with other corporate persons. They're not able to socially make an agreement or a deal with them. Like the United States and Iran, can they make a deal? Can they socially make a contract, an agreement? There's no political mechanism which both Iran and the United States trust to adjudicate their dispute, so they can't go through the UN or any other kind of organization. Instead, they're reduced to, can we make a social deal? They're denied access to the political, and this increases their chance of regressing into hostility and war.
Okay, so to roll it back to the AI portion, the problem with AI, and as someone who studied and worked on it to a lesser degree, it's not going to ever do what they say it's going to do, right? The large language model scheme is already breaking down. It's kind of self-corrupting in a way. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that the reason why there was so much money put behind the artificial intelligence question was that everyone knows that, you know, the ruling class, the financial class, and so on, that we're facing a lot of big crises coming up, right? The biggest crisis that came along, which directly preceded the large investments into AI, which before, I mean, the AI had existed since the 70s and the money was not going into it. It was the miniaturization of transistors. Once transistors in computer chips were miniaturized, it kind of created a massive crisis in the market. A lot of profits were being redistributed out of the transistor market, so the microchip market was making well over 100x profits year on year. After miniaturization happened, Intel almost went out of business, NVIDIA almost went out of business. And if you look at the way in which the AI market is structured, NVIDIA will buy shares, they'll invest in OpenAI to buy NVIDIA chips, so they can invest in NVIDIA to buy, or invest in OpenAI to buy NVIDIA chips. So there's a kind of Ponzi scheme going on right now in the market, which is why it's still going. But there are tons of businesses saying things like, I need to hire twice as many engineers now to double check what the AI is producing. Now that the models are starting to price at what they actually cost, and they're not pricing on the supplemented costs, we ran through our AI budgets in 1 month, right? The budget for the whole year was run through the month. They're very expensive, they don't work very well, and I can describe the mechanism for this, but as you run them, they will work less and less. They'll become less and less useful as you run the model. So there's that angle. The other angle is like, why is there an Iran conflict, right? That was mentioned briefly there. Like, why was there a conflict with Iran? And the problem is that all of the stated problems that we have with Iran are not the problems with Iran. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. We would like to control that. Iran also has a lot of oil. We would like to be able to control that production, right? As we are being contracted in the sphere of empire, we're looking for more places to poke at, and there are very few places that we can poke at. Iran is maybe the softest target, and I don't think we can actually do anything about Iran. I think Iran is kind of an impossible target. But but it's much easier than China, and it's much easier than Russia, right? So that's kind of my estimation of the argument.
Yeah, I guess,
Oh, yeah.
okay, so try to say something about the Iran bit and try to say something about the AI part. So on Iran, I will say my bias here is to be slightly suspicious of sort of grand structural explanations of individual, individual foreign policy decisions in this example, or other kinds of, individual state policy decisions. I think like historical materialism is a really good way of thinking about view from 10,000 feet kinds of questions. Why did the world used to be full of feudal lords and peasants? Why is it now full of capitalists and workers? And why do we gravitate toward the approximate kind of political institutions that we do that serve the reproduction of those systems and all that stuff? But I think there's an awful lot of messiness and contingency and like sort of individual decision making. And some of this really, I think you could maybe have a somewhat more structural explanation of like kind of the last few decades of tension between the US and Iran, but a lot of this stuff is really just about like, who Donald Trump had his last conversation before breakfast with the day, that he decided to go, right? So I do think on AI, that, like, I agree with you that a lot of the hype, right, from the tech oligarchs themselves, when they say, actually we're really scared of what we're creating, etc. I believe the part where they say they feel the need to do it, right, because that's just the old, blind imperatives of capital accumulation, right? You have to do the profitable thing before the other guy does, right? That's sure, no problem, right? I think I'm more skeptical they'd actually welcome regulation, although I guess it depends on the details, but I particularly am skeptical when they talk about how they're creating artificial gods that are gonna, destroy us all and all that. I think a lot of that is hype to build excitement about the product. And although I guess I will say that that I think that it's I think that whether AI ever develops human equivalent intelligence, never mind more than human equivalent intelligence, is a different question from whether it kills us all. There is a scenario where it kills us all without doing that, right? I always think here of the scene in Terminator 2 where Arnold Schwarzenegger is driving and John Connor asks him how Judgment Day happens, and he says the system goes online August 4th, 1997. Human decisions are removed from strategic defense. Skynet begins to learn at a geometric rate. I remember thinking, well, wait a second. Seems like the problem is the human decisions are removed from strategic defense, not the Skynet begins to learn at a geometric rate, right? Like, if you have something that's literally mindless, that's making military decisions, that's actually at least as scary as something that's sentient doing it. And certainly if you look at, to go back to the Studebaker point from a minute ago, if you think about the way that AI has actually been used, Iran, widely blamed for some of the worst, airstrikes there. Certainly very well documented in Gaza, right? That you have these, AI systems that, the algorithm, guesses, when somebody who it thinks might be a legitimate target is in the right area, which is, look, if your goal is just to offload responsibility while you kill as many people as possible, then that's great, right? Like works very well for that. But, to the extent that you're using it for decision making where that's not your goal, right? Like is potentially disastrous, right? There was a article like a few months ago about this study where a bunch of LLMs were given these like war games with nuclear strategy, and they kept recommending nuclear first strikes like over and over and over again, right? Which so I think like I think so. I think you could be appropriately skeptical right, about strong AI and still think that it's entirely possible that, you know, that the weak AI can kill us all anyway.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just gonna kind of invoke the moderator's privilege and ask a question. What are the connections between your theory of the elites and the possibility of leftist politics in terms of the qualitative transformation of society? So, kind of going back to the panel prompt, what do you think is going on with the elites right now, and does that contain any possibilities for leftist politics? For everyone.
Well, so what I think we're looking at, right, is a total collapse of any kind of notion of elite prior to this moment. So we had a whole system set up that was designed, as you talk about, to remove any elite quality from society. And that goes down to, the engineering in this country is just not as good as it was in the 70s. The thinking in politics is degraded and all this kind of stuff. You don't really have to think to make decisions, and so people have stopped thinking. So that's kind of what I get out of your description, right? You're trying to describe some kind of grand notion of state dissolving. I'm at least hearing from that, okay, in the time we live right now, there are no people who understand, at least not in any large quantity, understand how things work. Don't understand how things are moving forward. And so what are the potentials for the left are to understand how things work, right? I think that might be why we're here having the discussion in the first place, is that in 2008, we had a big financial crash, and everyone said, I don't understand this. I'm gonna talk to the guys who say they understand, and they had no answers for it. They said, well, you see the marginal rate of return on this thing, and if you follow this curve, this shouldn't have happened. And so they gave up, and Marxists showed up. And now they're trying to figure out again, okay, how do we describe things? And so, okay, we're gonna have AI run everything. Find some guy, we'll give him a bunch of money, he'll make a god for us to worship, and that'll run the so the massive, what a great boon for us. If we're the only ones thinking about it, right, the whole notion of being an elite is to solve problems for society. Whoever can solve people's problems ends up in power, right? If you can't figure out how to solve problems, maybe someone else comes along and solves the problem, then they're the ones in charge. But if no one else is thinking, the only people who are thinking appear to be people on the left, as far as I can tell. And I've listened to tons of different liberal economists, and conservative economists, and conservative politicians, and all these kinds of guys, and they have no idea of how you would solve these things. Like, you've got people like Curtis Yarvin saying, like, well, if only we had a king, what are you talking about? That's not a description of how the economy is evolving, and we need to set up these sorts of things to accommodate for that and all this kind of stuff. They don't even have that on the right wing. The bourgeois politicians are not sitting there coming up with a description of how they're going to set the world up so that they can continue to exist. I assume that they are trying to figure that out, and they might get there before we figure it out, and then they'll stabilize things again. But I would suspect we would start hearing about it. They would start pushing narratives of, oh, if only we did these kinds of things. But the narratives you get, and you can follow them because you open up a kid's Instagram. What are they telling you to do? It's join multi-level marketing schemes, gamble your life away, right? Get really strong and beat people up, and it's just, okay, become a nightmare and become the perfect rube for every scheme so that we can steal all your money and leave because we don't know how to solve the problem, right? Maybe they'll go to Argentina, as Manal mentioned, right? Peter Thiel's like, I tried the AI thing, that seems like it failed, I'm gonna leave, right? So maybe they pack their bags and move to a different country and fuck that one up. Maybe they overinvest in India, right? If you heard about the, J Street is currently pumping up all kinds of short sells over in India. They're doing some kind of crazy market. So maybe that's their target. They're like, there's nothing left to steal in America. We're gonna leave, right? So if that's the case, then the only people who are left thinking about problem solving are people like us sitting in this room. Right now, if we take that seriously, we can do something about it. We can say, okay, we actually do have a responsibility here because we're thinking about the problems and no one else are. Or we can say, everything's too big for us, we can't figure it out, and then, random guys in Ford F-150s with shotguns will storm the Capitol and take things over and figure it out, maybe, right? That's how certain people describe these things. That's kind of how, the Russian Revolution, it comes through and a bunch of people show up and they say, or not the Russian Revolution, sorry, the French Revolution comes up and you get all these guys going, we're gonna establish these rules and all this kind of stuff, and then peasants say, that's not helping me, I'm gonna kill you, right? We're gonna come, Enragé and all these different groups come through and they sack the palaces and they kill people. It's not going fast enough. So maybe that can happen without, right? We're kind of in a unique circumstance to just spitball here. Maybe there's no intellectuals, there's no problem solving, no one knows what they're doing, and it becomes Mad Max at some point, right? Who knows, right? I mean, I just think that this is a very unique circumstance, and projecting where we're going is very difficult, and we could come up with something.
So, Ben Burgis, Studebaker, do you guys have any thoughts?
You wanna do me a favor, give me a minute to figure out if there's a
Sure. All right, so I think that there is really, I don't think right now, any possibility of any social unit suddenly developing political capacity. I think that the effect of being administered and administered more and more heavily in more and more areas of life is that social and political capacities decay. So I don't think that there's any great likelihood of a social revolution. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be social change or transformation, but that social change and transformation will not be directed by social units. It will be a consequence of the struggle among corporate persons. So when you have a legitimation crisis and corporate persons are discontented with the behavior of other corporate entities that they've constructed, that may have a directionality to it. Those conflicts, those tensions may have directionality. If we observe that behavior without being scared, then we might be able to understand what's going on. And in attempting to understand what's going on, we'll develop certain skills and qualities that may help us gradually over time to be able to do a little bit more. But I think right now, there's enormous confusion because people think, there's an Epstein class that runs the world from an island bunker, where they make decisions in secret through a deliberation that no one has access to, and then run a blackmail operation to control everybody. People have these very fanciful ideas about how the world works that comes from this desperate desire to retain the social and insist that somehow the social must be directing things from somewhere. Somebody, somewhere must be able to do politics through the social. People are comforted by the idea that there's a social unit that can still do politics. It's kind of scary to take seriously, But if you're scared, then this will cause you to adopt an elite theory. It will cause you to become a supplicant. If you can resist the fear and just take a really hard look at what's actually going on, then there's an opportunity to learn something, just like Avatarang does. In the episode with Ko, where he actually goes and meets with Ko, and he asks Ko a question, and Ko answers him, and he doesn't get his face stolen because he's not scared of Ko. You can watch and observe the behavior of corporate persons without simply becoming terrified and playing with them to give you a middle-class life, and without trying to avoid having to think about them by positing social units that have fictive political capacities they don't in fact have. There is no possibility of a bunch of people organizing together, storming the Capitol, and taking the state on behalf of any ideology, anything, any social class, whatever, right wing, left wing, whatever, doesn't matter. There is no entity right now which has the capacity to do that. None. If you were to have a coup, it would be some corporate entity acting against other corporate entities. When you have rebellion in the world system today, it's typically some corporate entity rebelling against other corporate entities for corporate reasons that are not reducible to the reasons of particular people.
Well, I obviously do think we can rebuild the capacities of the social at the bottom of society. That as long as the contradiction between labor and capital exists, the possibility of workers' movement that can be effective over time also exists. The only way to, in my view, the only way to actually end that possibility, as opposed to just having it not being activated, is if we moved in retreat to some sort of Mad Max scenario. Right. I agree that it's immensely difficult. I also agree that that there's certainly any time soon a realistic road to socialism, in advanced Western democracies isn't going to look very much like the guys with the I don't know, I'm bad with gun names, but they have whichever one it was, right? The F-150s, whatever they had. It's probably not going to look very much like that, and I think it's a very long haul, because I think that part of one way, I was thinking about what I could add to, because I do think that my original presentation was very much geared around the question you just asked, right? So most of what I had to say, I think I said there, certainly as far as it went to the elite question, the PMC question. But I do think that one way of framing the problem that might make contact with some of what Ben Studebaker said earlier is that capital, under normal circumstances, doesn't need to be socially organized, right? Like in that, in order to work, its will, which is ultimately the will of capital accumulation, that's the. If I was following up, my apologies, man, I've never seen Avatar, but they have if I'm following the code thing, right? That would be the equivalent, right? That like it's that the imperatives that the people, like the actual capitalists in some sense, are just people who've had their faces stolen, right? That's never needed, right? Under normal circumstances, organization, sort of class consciousness, class organization, to make its will known to the world. In fact, if anything, historically, when you do get class consciousness and class organization in what I would think of as the ruling class, it tends to be a response to class consciousness and class organization from the bottom of society. Business associations and stuff like that, right? That employers associations tend to happen in response to powerful union movements, which is one of the reasons why in the United States, even though there's no country in the advanced liberal capitalist world where capital's got more of what it wants. We've actually tended to have relatively unorganized capitalists because they don't need to be. Whereas workers, to even win minor concessions, never mind to take the whole store and have socialism, do need to organize. And the really unfortunate thing here is that those collective action problems that are involved in doing that are very, like I think they can only be overcome by this very arduous work of building up solidaristic culture, which is what organizers do. Because under normal circumstances, individual rank and file workers have, their matrix of incentives include lots of incentives not to organize, not to get involved, to keep their heads down, right? It's a much safer choice. And so I think that can, I think the process of trying to overcome that and do movement building is incredibly difficult, and most of the time you're gonna lose, right? That's the track record, right? But I do think that there is a path where that's successful, And I think that's the only, my view, not to be too sloganistic about it, is that that's the only path that's leading anywhere that's worth going.
But I'll say it like this. Again, you're like, at least in my view, right but not really, or right really, really correct in one way and then really incorrect in another. Wait, so where you're incorrect is you say it's impossible for people to come and storm the Capitol and take things over. Now, realistically, if you get like, a couple thousand guys in trucker hats and F-150s, and they just shoot everyone in Congress, and they shoot the president, and then they set up a guy who says, well, I'm the president. If that was even able to take place in the first place, then yeah, the government is gone, right? And now,
No, it's not. It's
No.
not gone.
what exists?
The stage is not gone. The state doesn't need those persons. It can find other persons.
But the problem is that if it could happen, the state has already disintegrated. So the prerequisite for these guys, I mean, okay, maybe like they did show up at the Capitol and they threatened people and they didn't defend them, because in some sense they were like, well, we don't need these guys or something like that. But it's basically it would be a symbolic, like, oh, the state has dissolved. There's no way, for instance, how are you gonna pave roads anymore if, or how are you going to justify the existence of California if all of the ports shut down and all the trucking companies say, well, we can't truck in because gas is $15 per gallon, so we can't justify shipping as much, right? There is a number.
If you had a totalizing legitimation crisis in which no particular people cooperated at all with corporate persons,
Right.
then yes, corporate persons would not be able to function. But in practice, particular people do not believe that there is some other way that they can organize life free of these corporate persons. So when in practice they engage in struggle, they typically are looking to change the form of management or to change the kind of corporate personation, rather than to actually end or abolish corporate personhood. Even consider, for instance, take the state, right? To take the state is to try to, in some way, get control of the corporate person, which typically, if you were actually able to do it, would mean you'd be able to reinstitute politics.
Right.
But actually, when people try to reinstitute politics, they very rarely succeed in doing that. And if they do, it's usually very fleeting and then immediately collapses back into administrative imperatives.
Okay, right. But
Because there's a real actual use for administration, which is to make peace, to prevent chaos, to prevent disorder.
Right.
The first thing that would happen if you killed all of the members of Congress and the president is that people would want something back which could perform the role which those people perform. And you might even get elections after that. That might be special elections in line with the Constitution might be the way in which you replace them.
Right.
Or a military coup in which the administrative apparatus of the military temporarily runs the state until it's able to replace the people.
Right. So I think we're dealing with an issue where you have an extremely expansive way of describing the situation, when if we look at it from just how a normal person is going to look, they're going to say, there was a revolution, all these people died, and now we have a new country. Now, you could say, aha, but look, you are still participating in the actions of corporate persons, and then the guy tells you to shut up.
That's not a more expansive way of talking about it. It's a more particular, specific way of talking about it. It involves defining, in very concrete terms, lots of specific words,
but
so that we're able to talk about what's happening in a more intellectually astute way.
Right, yes, but it's...
That's the point of philosophy, to be able to operationalize concepts.
I'm disagreeing with the necessity of this level of philosophizing. But I at least in this context, there definitely appears to be a very good way of using this. It feels cross-purpose, right? If we're talking about the left, like, of course, we're going to establish a state, and the state is going to be run, and it's going to have kind of administrators which run things. That's a useful discussion. Maybe it's I think that's why it's really helpful. in some ways, and it's not helpful because we're not used to discussing things in legal sense.
On that note, I'm gonna take Isaac's question. I
Sorry.
think it'll probably help clarify.
Yeah, well, I just wanna kinda, Mr. Studebaker, while I really do appreciate your postulationization, your, literaryzationizing is interesting with regards to the elite. Reducing the feedback signals that you were talking about, Marcello, how cybernetics comes into being. But when you look at the elite and you go with your proposition to say, okay, how do we actually solve this issue of taking back the political? We've seen the emails. We've looked at what these people talk about.
Yeah.
How far down do we need to go before we decide to make a decision that who is more likely to take that political power? Someone who is doing the work of organizing those structures that are a base of operations to work from when any sort of situation is to collapse into chaos, or a group of people who are instantiated in these higher political areas? And what differentiates what you're saying from the petty bourgeois versus the ultra, rich? Of course millionaires are competing with each other, and billionaires as well. That's nothing new to what Marxists are talking about. So I'm just curious what maybe your response would be to that.
My response is that the question is what corporate persons are we going to have, and whether the struggle among the corporate persons creates any kind of space for the return of politics, and even inclusive of the return of a politics by corporate persons. You could have a world war that tears apart the post-World War II order, and then at the end of that conflict, there would be some effort to create some new structure to make a peace, to prevent that from happening again. And in the construction of that, you would have to have politics occur, even if it occurred among corporate persons. You can have a lot of forms of struggle that are very intensive, that don't involve anyone in society, any social unit taking power. And I think that a lot of the time, people have been looking for social units, when a lot of what's been going on has been the activity of corporate persons. Now, I think the experience of social units and what social units do in response to all of this is very interesting. In my book, I talk about the despair that people in society feel because they come to recognize that they are totally disempowered and they can't do very much at all. And that the various forms of organization that are open to them suck all of their time, waste it, and give them nothing in return. That's the point I was making about talking shops. These days, a lot of the time, people think they're engaged in social or political organizing, and they're in a talking shop. They're in something which doesn't meet the very specific criteria I laid out for being able to do politics. And the reason I went into that level of specificity is because if you don't, something that just seems to be related to the state or seems to be related to government, or what we colloquially think of as the state or government, people will assume that if it's related to those things aesthetically, that it must be political activity or it must be social activity.
Right.
We're encouraged to use these words in a very broad, vague way by administrative systems, which often want to say that what they're doing gives us these things.
Okay. Let's see if I can draw it out. Maybe my attempt will be in vain, but does it matter the character of this state? So, is it relevant that Epstein and people who visited his island and all this kind of thing exist within our world, right? The world of the United States includes people who go to Epstein Island, who happen to be in elite positions, who do these horrible things. Does the character of our state have an influence over that? Does that have an influence over the state? Would it exist regardless? What would your idea be of that?
I just don't think it's very important. It's criminal activity.
Right?
People, if insofar as if they are actually doing what they're alleged to have done in terms of abusing and exploiting people and prostitution and so on, then they're engaged in criminal activity. Criminal activity can occur in lots of different types of systems.
Sure.
And I'm not that interested in criminal activity because it's not politics.
But criminal activity is actually very, very important to the actions of the state. What criminal activity is allowed? What criminal activity are we participating in? And what criminal activity are we completely negating? So
But a
for
lot of criminal
instance-
activity is social bargaining or social exchange that is not classified in the law, has not been administered. People have not been able to find a way to administer that activity. Like, for instance, when you have the Chicago machine works on the basis of you're a precinct captain, you get votes for the Chicago machine. When the Chicago machine wins the election, then you get a job, right? So there's a kind of social bargain, and then this results in the giving of an administrative role to a particular person. But they got rid of the Chicago machine by preventing the Chicago machine from giving jobs to people who had worked for it in precincts. They created an administrative system for distributing jobs that blocked the corrupt, criminal behavior of the Chicago machine. Generally, what we think of as corrupt or criminal behavior is social activity that is illegal, that is something that we're trying in some way to administer away through our administrative apparatuses. And oftentimes administrative apparatuses accomplish valuable and worthwhile things from many points of view by getting rid of forms of social activity that we think are bad or unjust. They can install meritocratic ways of distributing things, where previously you have old boys networks or social clubs or ways of doing it that strike us as inappropriate or rigged in some way for some particular social entity or social unit. But I don't think it's that important from the point of view of political theory, unless you're alleging that what we have is a kleptocracy. We have a system that is so riven with crime and criminal activity that that's the way we have to characterize it.
Well, if you
But that would be a very social system as opposed to a very administrative one.
Right. Well, if you look at the way that, okay,
So,
yeah.
sorry, could we see if Ben Burgis wants to say anything on this?
No, I'm good. I do see a bunch of hands up there. Do you want-
Yeah,
you
let's-
want-
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Ishmael, you've had your hand up.
Thank you. No, I do appreciate the conversation. I wanted to jump in earlier when you were talking about 2008.
yes.
This is interesting because I do think there's a sense that there's been an attempt to rethink of a type of socialist politics after 2008. Now, the way that you described it was maybe people in this room asking these questions, that's what we need, and that's what the left tried to do in 2008. But it's interesting because I wanted to ask, one, is something like Sanders, Mamdani, are we trying to really be the elites of the left? Like, is the point politically to study 2008, use the writings of Marxism to make sense of the capitalist crisis that the capitalists don't fully understand, but we do, and then mobilize that? Because on one hand, I feel the point that Studebaker is raising is there's an impossibility of the social dimension, and that issue of repeating that type of elitism is just not, it's not even possible. And so I wanted you guys to talk about that. Orthodox Marxism, something like what Lenin is doing, is not to me the same thing. I don't think Lenin is trying to become some sort of expert of the left in his time. There was a political and social movement. There were politics at stake,
Right.
and the writings are sort of reflective of that. They're not just coming out of or trying to inspire. The best I get is, the best might be we do try to do a deep understanding, and then we raise our own elites to whatever degree we can to push things forward. So I would like more specificity from Burgis about, yes, there's this incrementalism. I don't want to actually have it's not in a pejorative way. It's like there's an impossibility that we all agree in this room of the political, of the social. And I want to get a sense of, how is it different than getting a type of elite that can push us to more left-leaning social policy? Is that the path forward to a type of political state, taking over the state in some sort of way? Yeah, and then finally, I guess, does the working class still make history?
Yeah.
I think the elite theory and what I make sense of PMC after Aaron Reichs is there's a type of ideology the PMC has. It's not just the Burnham movement of managerials historically, but there's a type of spillover of the ideology of the elites that is, maybe really identity politics, taking away from working class solidarity. And I wonder if, what role does that ideological concept of the elites influence the left and its own possibility of reconstituting itself. I know that's a very platypus way of phrasing it, Ben, but I hope you forgive me and you can see where I'm coming from.
Sure. I mean, I clearly do think that the working class still makes history. That was the primary burden of my initial comments, right? I mean,
Right.
that was the main thing I was arguing for, was that the working class is the only possible agent of socialist political transformation. And that, you know, the reason why, you know, I mean, never mind in the sort of Burnham way, but even in the Ehrenreich way, right, which I think, you know, definitely there are ways that it, you know, makes contact with very recognizable realities, right, you know, about the political culture around us. But even in that way, right, like I don't ultimately accept it, or at the very least, I think that for certain purposes, talking about like the PMC is fine in like a folk concept sort of way, right? Like it's imprecise, but we kind of know what you mean, and like it gestures at things we might sometimes just want to vaguely gesture in the direction towards. But I think if you want to be more precise and you want to use, you know, social scientific terminology, not folk terminology, then I think you have to talk in terms of class positions understood in terms of relationship to the means of production. And that's why I think ultimately the sort of useful way of capturing the data that PMC theory is trying to capture is something like that Eric Goldwright, you know, relief map of contradictory class positions, precisely because if you can understand where people who might in some way be socially intermediary, might have interests that align with workers in some ways, but like pull in the other direction in other ways, that like, if you have a better understanding of that, you can better understand the ways in which you might be able to bring some of those people on board, right? You know, with the workers' movement, which is ultimately what we need. As far as there was this sort of Mamdani part of the question, right? You know, I think that it kind of sounds like the word elite might be being used in a couple of different ways in that question. And I guess some of what Marcello was saying earlier sort of used the word in that way too, right? But like, I think that if you have, right, what you characterized as incrementalism earlier, I'm not terribly fussed one way or the other about what word we use to describe it. I just want to be clear that we're all talking about the same thing, right? I think that, you know, so I think that there are question, the part of the question here is about like, okay, you know, what do we think that rupture from capitalism, right? That, you know, in the sense of, you know, a revolution where we're sort of imagining a 1789 or 1917 style insurrection on the streets, right? You know, do we think that that's likely? Certainly anytime soon, right? And I think that there's, you know, I think there's, I'm not sure what the Stalin's perspective is here, but you know, with but you know, certainly there's some agreement that that's not going to happen, right? Certainly anytime soon, right? So I think that what you need to focus on is finding ways of building up the power of the working class while eroding the power of the capitalist class, with nonetheless the ultimate goal being some sort of rupture, right, from capitalism, where I think at a certain point some intellectual humility is called for, you know, in terms of like knowing exactly what that would realistically look like under the circumstances that we're living in right now, which are, you know, very different from a crumbling semi-feudal empire at the beginning of the 20th century. You know, but I think that if you're thinking about, okay, look, if your medium-term goal is a stronger working class and a weaker capitalist class, right? I think that there are basically two obvious ways of achieving it, and the two complement each other, right? They work together, right? One is trying to, you know, build up stronger institutions directly of the working class. We're primarily, though not exclusively, talking about the labor movement and workplaces there, and then the other is the effort to engage in working class political activity in the electoral sphere. And I think a lot of American Marxists really fetishize the question, you know, the party question in a way that's sort of much more imported from Europe and categories that make sense there than it is organic to American political conditions. I think that the sort of, I think that the kind of tactical landscape about, using major party primaries versus, trying to have third party ballot lines and all of that, is ultimately all a bit secondary. But, yeah, sure. Anytime you're engaged in electoral efforts to bring about reforms that are going to, strengthen, are going to create a better terrain for the workers' movement to fight on. Inevitably, part of that is you are talking about electing people to office. So if you want to call that them being an elite, sure, I can understand that way of using the term. That's fine, right? But ultimately, the question is what's the social base that is elected them to office, and ideally, right? I mean, I think that in the long term, we're not there yet, right? But ideally, in the long term, what's the kind of movement on that social level that, I think can be rebuilt? I think my fellow band is more pessimistic, right? On the social level, what's the kind of movement that could exercise a meaningful check on those office holders when they get out of line, right? Because, right now, for better or for worse, right? I mean, if like, for most like elected left-wing office holders, if, DSA decides tomorrow to, unendorse them, right? They know that it's not going to have any real effect on anything that happens, right? There's just not enough social strength there at the base for that to mean that there's like a real danger of like a meaningful primary challenge or anything like that, right? So again, I think that this stuff, unfortunately, is very difficult and complicated to build up, but I mean, that is the task.
I think there's maybe a more interesting way of using the word elite, right? So we could define it as anyone who holds office or anyone who happens to be rich, all this kind of stuff. And I did kind of vaguely gesture at that. Another way of defining an elite would be those problem solvers that I mentioned, which solving a problem is kind of an agnostic thing, right? If I posit here's a solution to the problems we're going through now, right? We have a huge collapse in the financial markets, right? That's coming through. If we say, okay, let's break up companies and let's make things more even and restructure things, spend 15 years bringing businesses back here so people start rebuilding things. That does not necessarily undermine the financial class, only insofar as they could allow themselves that potential to sit on top of that, make a little bit less money, and then 15 years later have a new country to rock, right? So if they're sitting there and they're looking at people at the gate and they're like, oh my goodness, they're gonna kill me, there's no way out of this, and someone comes along agnostically and says, here's the set of solutions, you could reconstruct capitalist society very weakly and then allow that to progress a little bit longer and then rebuild it. In the same way, you could kind of do the same sort of things. We're gonna have things be rebuilt here, we're gonna do all this kind of stuff, but we're going to remove this financial class, right? We're going to take away the power of finance to kind of dictate our livelihood. Well, okay, that's a different solution, but realistically, it could be the same guy saying it, right? So this is where the kind of anxiety amongst leftists about this incrementalist approach comes from. It's like, oh, what if we get in there and we propose the solution and it's a salve which forestalls the inevitable collapse of everything, right? I mean, that's potentially what happened in the 40s, right? Or in the 30s when FDR surrounded himself with people who were members of the Communist Party. And they did a whole bunch of things that the Communist Party suggested that they do. And then capitalism came back in resurgence and America became this great empire, right? So, you know, if we want to make a value judgment and say, no, we should never engage in the political process because it has the potential for this terrible thing, I think that's reasonable. I think the problem is that you still have to, because in order to be able to solve political problems, you have to have political skill set. So if you're not politically versed, if you don't understand how these things operate, okay, you're not gonna know how to run a government, right? This is what Studebaker is talking about is, okay, the government has to exist at some point, and it exists in a sort of kind of specific way. I think he's too, it's hard to tell, right? It's too much, I'll have to talk to you more about this. It's seems like a much longer conversation to get it into my head, but maybe too thick for it. But when you're building a government, it's still a government. You still have apparatchiks, you have functionaries, you have people administering things. And so knowing how to do those things is important. Now, we could say, instead of just being politicians, we're going to be guys who work with unions, or we're going to build a cooperative and figure out how that works, and kind of develop that skill set. What works and what doesn't work, and you kind of understand how the economy works a little better. Maybe you can offer better solutions, right? And then, okay, when does that come about? It's in that crisis moment. So what are we doing is we're trying to practice for when it matters, right? What the proletariat does is the capitalist class eats itself continuously. That's what it's doing now. It's robbing everyone, which if you don't pay people, then no one can buy anything, so they're gonna make less money. And they're gonna hurt themselves, and it's all gonna collapse. So what does the proletariat do? It continues to exist, whereas the capitalist class is getting rid of itself. So what makes the history is when, okay, the capitalist class is sitting there, decaying on top of it as a festering sore, and the proletariat scratches, tries to figure out how to solve that problem. Now, do we solve that issue, or do we come in and cut it off, this kind of thing, we allow decapitation of all these kinds of people, or whatever the case may be, right? If we're talking about, okay, what are the elites for the left, it's those people who can then posit that solution, right? Is it going to be, you know, some kind of renaissance of revolution? Probably not. It's going to be a long process of dealing with these things and figuring out what the problems are. Now, the Stalinist perspective is you cut off the financial class, and whatever solution allows the financial class to continue to exist is a poor solution. But that's, I mean, we can talk about that as opinion, right? Because a country would continue to exist with a financial class, it's just going to be weaker and weaker as things go along, and we're going to be in a weaker and weaker position over time.
Yeah, any other remarks on that topic? Does anyone else have any questions, or we good? Yeah.
Well, we should do one question with closing remarks for like whatever anybody wants to just conclude with. It could be short, it could be as long as you want, but
I think in absence of questions, we're just gonna do closing remarks for. Okay, for sure. You have a question?
Yeah, like as like quickly as possible. Like,
Sorry.
I just don't get what I guess I kind of get what Ben is saying has to do with socialism, but I really don't get what you two are saying has to do with socialism. What is it? What is what you guys are saying have to do with socialism?
Which Ben were you referencing?
Studebaker, sorry. I kind of get what you're saying. It's like it's not like we shouldn't misrecognize the politics that we're doing as heading in that direction. Yeah, what do you two, I guess, see as socialism, and then how do you see like what you're proposing as moving in that direction?
Yeah, I have to say I'm a little bit confused by that because the entirety of the opening statement was about nothing but how a transition to socialism could happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I
it was like
very curious about like what you're gonna have to do more to help me see the gap that you want me to fill.
Okay, I guess you said something that the capitalists could give the means of production to like the
Sure.
working class as a gift, like that
Sure.
was like, kind of like hypothetically possible. So like,
But they won't.
yeah, but they won't. So I guess, do you see socialism as that, like just someone else having the means of production?
Sure.
Or,
So I would say modes of production are primarily differentiated, this is certainly Marx's view, by which, what the primary relations of production are in the society. In other words, do you have lords and serfs, do you have slaves and slave owners, do you have workers and capitalists, or do you have the most common way that you describe socialism, which is a society of associated producers, right? A society where where you don't have a division between a class of producers and a class of exploiters, because you have some sort of collective democratic ownership and management of means of production. This is how most socialists have always understood socialism. The look of confusion you're giving me tells me that you've probably been indoctrinated into a relatively eccentric understanding of socialism that doesn't fit with this, and I don't know how much I can help you with that.
Alright, fair enough.
Okay, what is socialism from our perspective? Socialism is basically how Ben described it. Okay, you've got a community of producers. What does that look like? I think that we can find, so there's one of the more provocative answers that Oswaldine, our chairman, has given, which is that we already live in socialism. Now, what is that actually referencing? It's going to be because more what Studebaker is talking about, which is that a worker is not in the kind of delineated relationship. There's like, oh, here's a manager of this place. The capitalist is hired out by the financial firm and gets a board of directors appoints a CEO. The CEO manages this, and so a way of viewing socialism would be to say, well, flip the pyramid on its head, and you have the workers appointing the bosses, and you have the economy not being run by, okay, what is most profitable for financial interests, but as a way of, okay, how do we get the resources where they need to go so that people can have the things that they need, and then how, this is when the key question is, because that question was solved fairly quickly under Stalin. The next question really is, and then what about the extra stuff? That's a harder question. I think that has been answered by China in one way with their markets. It's been answered different ways. There's other possibilities. But again, the problem with socialism is that, okay, it's a transitionary stage, and then you have to have a transition then into communism. Communism being, how is it you get rid of that administrative layer? And you turn the level of the economy, right? You take that away from the administrators and you somehow send that out to everyone. That's at least the way I've read about it, read through it, understand the way that works. How? Again, that's why we say we don't have crystal balls. I think it gets presented to us as we develop this next phase, right? If people are sitting there and they go to administrators and they say, well, I want such and such, I want these things to be built. Instead, they say, or I want these resources to build these things. Instead, a computer just kind of automatically allocates resources to the factory, and you don't need complicated calculations. You hit a button and the steel appears. That goes a long way towards that kind of process. That's very complicated. That would be a very complicated system, but that's a rough approximation.
All right, thank you. We're gonna have everyone do some very quick closing remarks for 5 minutes each, if that's all right. I'll let you guys know when it's about the 4-minute mark. So could we start with Benjamin Studebaker, please?
All right, so I will be relatively brief. I think that there has been a kind of handover that has occurred of decision-making power to entities that can't be described as social units in any way which is credible, although they often claim to be speaking on behalf of social units. They often tell legitimation stories in which they present themselves as speaking on behalf of social units. In practice, these entities can hardly be described as doing that. It would be more accurate to describe these corporate persons as kind of artificial persons. And so I want to suggest to you, I know this is a different way of viewing the world, it's very Hobbes, that there has already been a triumph of artificial intelligence in an important sense. We are already, and have been for hundreds of years with an increasing totality, been ruled by entities which cannot be described as social units or as straightforwardly representing the interests of particular social units. And I know that's kind of a weird way to think, but I do think that this is the insight that you can get from spending a lot of time with Thomas Hobbes. It's the corrective to an overly social ontology, which just assumes that social units have got to be at the bottom of everything that happens. And if you take it seriously, it opens up the set of ways in which you can see things. It doesn't abolish social terms. It doesn't mean that we can't speak about classes. In my first book, I have sections in which I discuss how different classes deal with all of this. But I think that if we're able to consider the way corporate personation has changed life, it allows us to think much more in dialogue with our present circumstances and to see the ways in which things have changed. One of the things that drives me crazy about the left is how little the left talks about corporations and how quick the left is to try to reduce any kind of corporate person to something concrete. And it's interesting because Marxism is very good about refusing to reduce capital to simply concrete persons. Capital is not reducible to the concrete. It's abstract. The fact that it's abstract doesn't make it not real or doesn't make it not matter. It doesn't have to be reduced to concrete to be something that matters. And the same is also true for things like states. And so I'm trying to invite you to consider the sense in which the state and also the things that states make. States make private corporations through their corporate law. They make federal entities by coming together into federal unions. And they make international institutions that create further legal procedures that go beyond them. States create all kinds of structures that can't be readily talked about in Rousseauian language in a way that feels true. And for all of those reasons, I encourage everybody to consider ways in which you can engage with stuff like Hobbes without treating that as reactionary or right-wing or in opposition to you. What Hobbes is doing is talking about a different kind of entity. He's taking the modern state seriously as a different kind of thing. A lot of the talk about artificial intelligence is worrying about something that's already occurred.
Cool. Well, I'm not against reading Hobbes, but I do think that if we're going to figure out how to get from the world that we have to a better future, I do think that has to run through, figuring out how to rebuild the social at the base of society. I guess to sort of expand on the earlier answer in a less snippy way, right? I will just shamelessly plug that I co-wrote a book that's coming out this fall. It's with Oscar Sankara and Mike Beggs called The Blueprint: How Socialism Can Work in the Real World. And yeah, I mean, I think there's probably, it was interesting as I was listening to Marcello earlier, and I was trying to think about, as somebody who's definitely not a Stalinist, what the, areas of overlap and divergence are, right? I think that I think there are probably some areas of overlap in terms of thinking about, you know, the sort of preferability of what they, I don't know, you know, what's sometimes called fully automated luxury communism, if you can figure out how to make it work, right? You know, in the long run, I think that in the short run, we probably can, right? Like, you know, I think that we can have. I still think that there's a realistic form of socialism that could be achieved in the 21st century without having to, you know, have any amazing technological breakthroughs, you know, without having to sort of rewire, you know, human psychology and how we respond to incentives in any crucial way. At least if by socialism you mean what I mean by socialism, what I take most socialists have always meant by socialism, right? Which is overcoming class divisions through collective ownership and you know, economic democracy. If Moshe Pistone or, you know, my old friend Doug Lane have convinced you that you know, socialism means can only mean overcoming the value form or whatever, right? Then all right, maybe this won't interest you, but you know, but if you can maybe get a little bit excited about the thought that maybe for the first time since the agrarian revolution, we could have a society that's not divided between a class of subordinate producers and a class of exploiters. I do think that's possible, and I do think that the only agent that could possibly bring us there would be an organized working class. So that's what I've tried to structure all of my comments today around.
Right. I'll say that there's two kind of levels of dialogue happening, right? There's the level that Studebaker is at with the state, and then there's the level that me and Mr. Burgis here have been at in terms of economics. And as I think through what you're talking about, and maybe as we dialogue more, hopefully, or read your books or whatever else, there is a relationship between the way you are describing the state and the way I have been critiquing the state since, not since when I started, but since the 1940s, right? The development of the state in the 1940s till now very much resembles what you're talking about. Now, at least I believe so. And so grappling with that, I think, is useful. There's differences in terms that you are using. There's differences in the way that you're describing things. But essentially how I would characterize it is, in the modern day, the purpose of the state has been to essentially take away the agency of all the little pieces, parts of it, so that it becomes predictable, and then you can render the job of state operator as kind of a clock in, clock out kind of deal. And so the invention of corporate persons, right, the corporate creation of things like that, which happens in the 30s, right? The idea of, and a little bit before that, and is preceded obviously far before that. But if we talk about the modern corporate idea, the modern conception of the corporate, you see that come about also in the 40s as being a kind of state conglomeration, right? Something set up by the state, at least in the way that we are in relationship to it. Now the relevance of that to how do we solve the problems now, I think is less important just because the economic concerns are going to override the state. The reason why it's worth thinking about is that obviously the economy comes back into play, the state can exist again, and then you have to think about the state again. And so having theories of state outside of economic theories makes a lot of sense. Grappling with those, if we have to break them into Marxist terminology, if we have to rationalize it in terms of that, hey, maybe. Or maybe there's your way of describing it is more helpful, these second and third order. I wanted to ask you a question about that. I'm getting a little bit confused in terms of the ordering of these things. I haven't read your books, and I should, clearly, to get the depth of that and see maybe if there are mistakes. It feels like there's some mistakes here. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're talking about because you have a broader thing. But I think that it's beyond the scope of the left as a specific concern for economic development, and more within the scope of anyone dealing with statecraft. If we were talking about modern states, or if you're saying that this started in Louis, you're saying Louis, the French aristocratic system is kind of the beginning of that? Is that what you're talking about? Hobbes?
Taking it back to Leviathan.
You're talking about Hobbes and Leviathan. Okay, well, it's interesting. I think it's a worthy area of thought that needs to be explored. It's where I'm going, actually, with my research, but in a different direction. So I'll say that it's definitely relevant, it's definitely worth taking seriously that direction, but I also think me and Ben, right, which are operating on this level of economic analysis, are also worth taking seriously. It's a conclusion, right?
All right, thank you all. Thanks for coming out to our platypus panel. The bathrooms are going to be located outside near the staircase for the men's. I don't know where the women's room is.
It's right across from it, but
Okay.
it's to the corner.
Yes, and also we're going to be going to Northern Cafe afterwards for dinner if you guys are interested. All right, thank you guys. Bye.
Round of applause for you, Margaret.